So in this video, we're going to have a look at the various organs found in plants. So if you have a look at this cross-section of a leaf, then you might recognize some of the tissues that we've already discussed when we looked at plant tissues. And we're going to look at how all of these tissues then work together to produce a specific function for each organ or for each part of the plant. So if we have a look at the journey that we've taken up to this point to try and understand how plants work, then we started this journey looking at how cells are different between plants and animals, and we looked at the cell structure of plant cells and the cell structure of animal cells. And then we moved on to look at the specific tissue types found in plants. So how are these cells specialized for very specific functions in plants? And we refer to that specialized cells as tissue. And now we're going to go another step further, and we're going to see how are these tissues combined to form what we refer to as organs. And these organs have very general functions that we are going to look at. And then further down the line, we're going to look at how these organs combine to form organ systems to, again, have a very broad general function. And then if we put all of the organ systems together, then that would form the final organism, or the final plant in this case. Okay, but for today, we're going to look here at the various organs found in the plants. So the best way to define organs is to say that organs are when tissues are arranged together for a specific function. Okay, so tissues arranged together to form organs. And the organs in plants are the roots, the stem, and the leaves. Flowers and fruit are also classified as organs, but we're not going to look at them in this video. So if we have a look at these organs, then one of the first things that we want to identify is what is the function of these organs. Because if we understand the function, then we can understand why it is structured in the way that it is, and how the structure of the tissue will allow the specific function. So always keep the function in mind, because that will help you understand the structure a bit better. So if we have a look at the leaves, then the primary function of the leaf or the leaves is photosynthesis and gases exchange. Okay, so photosynthesis, taking energy from the sun and turning it into food, and gases exchange, the exchange of gases, the movement of gases into and out of the leaf. Okay, so if you keep these functions in mind, then when we look at the structure, it starts to make a bit more sense why the leaf is structured the way that it is. If we then move on to the roots, so we looked at the leaves, if we then move on to the roots, the main function of the roots is to anchor the plant, and then the one that we are going to be primarily focusing on is the absorption of water and nutrients. Okay, so again, keep this function in mind when we look at the structure of the roots. And then lastly, the organ found in between the roots and the leaves is the stem. And the main function here is to provide some sort of support and transport system between these two. There are some other functions of the leaves that we will briefly mention, but this is kind of the main ones that we are focusing on, the support and transport between the leaves and the roots. Okay, so the first plant organ that we're going to look at is the leaves. So if we have a look at the cross-section of a leaf, then this is what you will see, and we're going to focus in, we're going to zoom in a bit, and we're going to see what kind of tissue is found in the leaves. So here you can see a key that identifies some of the broad categories of tissue found in all parts of the, or all organs of the plant. Okay, but this is just an overview. We're going to look now a lot more in depth at what is found inside of the leaf. So here we just provide an overview of what is found inside of the leaf. So we start off by just mentioning the function again, okay, the photosynthesis and gases exchange. And then we have a look at the three areas inside of the leaf. Okay, so we're going to split up the parts of the leaf into three areas. So we'll look at these independently. So the first area inside of the leaf that we're going to look at is the epidermis. Okay, and the epidermis is the upper and lower surfaces of the leaf. Okay, and their main function is just to protect the leaf. Okay, so they are made from these epidermal cells, which, if you remember from when we discussed plant tissue, epidermal tissue are these brick-shaped cells, and they have a few features that we're going to look at now, but the main function here is just to protect the leaf from the outside. The outer surface of the epidermal cells are covered with a waxy cuticle, and this forms an impermeable layer that prevents water from moving through. So it prevents water loss through the leaf. Okay, and this is going to become very important when we discuss the controlled exiting of water out of the leaf. Okay, so leaves do need to let water out, but it wants to have control over how much water it lets out. So the fact that the epidermis is covered with a waxy cuticle allows the leaf to control how much water moves out through the leaves. Another key feature of the epidermal cells is the fact that the cells are transparent, okay, because there isn't really any other organelles in the epidermal cells, and there especially isn't any chloroplasts that is responsible for photosynthesis. So it needs to let the light through so that the light can get to the underlying tissue where photosynthesis can take place. Okay, so the top and bottom layers are transparent to let the light through, so photosynthesis can take place in the middle of the leaf, okay, in the underlying tissue. There are, however, some specialized epidermal cells, which we have looked at in the past, that forms the stomata. Okay, so stomata are these form these little holes or pores in the leaf through which gases exchange can take place. So some of the gases that needs to move in and out of the plant are obviously oxygen and carbon dioxide. Oxygen because it is produced through photosynthesis, and carbon dioxide because it is needed for photosynthesis. So carbon dioxide needs to move in and oxygen needs to move out. Another gas that needs to move through these pores are water vapor. Okay, and we're going to look a lot more at this later when we look at transpiration, but water vapor needs to move out through the plant. And this is what I mentioned earlier as well when we discussed the cuticle. So the leaf can control the amount of water vapor that exits the plant by blocking the water vapor from moving out through the normal epidermal cells and only allowing water vapor to move out through the stomata. So the stomata being able to open and close allows the leaf to control how much water exits through the leaf. The second area in the leaf is called the mesophyll. So this is the area in between the two epidermal layers. And there's a few different tissues found here. So the first one is the palisade mesophyll, and these are these long perpendicular cells which are found right underneath the upper epidermis. And they are parenchyma tissue, and their main function is photosynthesis. So the reason that they are structured the way that they are is so that you can fit in as many of these palisade mesophyll cells as possible, so that you have the maximum amount of photosynthesis that can take place. So they are perpendicular to the surface of the leaf to maximize the exposure to the sun, to maximize the amount of photosynthesis that takes place. They also contain many chloroplasts for the same reason. Okay, the more chloroplasts, the more photosynthesis can take place. The second type of cells in the mesophyll is the spongy mesophyll, and then, as the name would suggest, the spongy mesophyll is not as tightly packed, so they have many more spaces in between, so they're loosely packed. They're also parenchyma tissue, and their main function is gases exchange. So the fact that there's all these big spaces between the cells allow the gases to move in between the cells, so that gases can easily move through the leaf, okay, when it needs to get in and out of the leaf. And the last tissue found in the mesophyll is the collenchyma. So the collenchyma is not illustrated in this picture here, but is usually found right above the vein and between the vein and the upper and lower epidermis. Okay, so you might find some collenchyma over here, and you might find some collenchyma over here. Okay, but in this case it is not illustrated here, but some illustrations you will see it. The one that you're going to have to label does have some collenchyma. And the function of the collenchyma is to provide support to the leaf blade. Okay, so collenchyma, if you remember from when we did plant tissue, is quite a strong tissue. It has relatively thick cell walls, and this thick cell walls gives it that added bit of protection, especially around the vein area, to protect the vein from any external forces on the leaf. The last area inside of the leaf that you will find is the vein or the vascular bundle. Okay, so as the name would suggest, the vascular bundle is responsible for transport in the leaf. And our two transport tissues is xylem and phloem. Okay, so the xylem is usually found in the upper part of the leaf, and its main function is the transport of water and minerals from the roots to the rest of the plant, or in this case specifically to the leaf. Okay, so just remember that xylem, upper part of the vein, and it's responsible for the transport of water and minerals from the roots to the rest of the plant. The other transport tissue is the phloem, and that is found in the bottom part of the vein usually, and the function here is to transport dissolved organic molecules or organic foods from the leaves to the rest of the plant. Okay, so an example of this would be, remember, photosynthesis takes place here in the mesophyll. Okay, so photosynthesis is going to produce glucose, and this glucose needs to be transported to the rest of the plant. So the way it will get to the rest of the plant is through the phloem. Okay, so this is one of the examples they refer to when we say dissolved organic food. Okay, so phloem is to transport these molecules that was made in the leaf, to transport them to other parts of the plant. And then the last part of the vein is the bundle sheath. Okay, so this is the layer of cells that you find around the vein. Okay, and this is made from sclerenchyma tissue, which is a very strong, tough plant tissue, and it protects the vein. So it's a protective layer around the xylem and the phloem. So if we then take all of these tissues that we've discussed and we put them together, then that should give us a rough approximation of what the cross-section of a leaf is going to look like. So this is my best attempt at illustrating it. Obviously this is very simplified, and the real cross-section doesn't have all of these bright colors, okay, but it works quite well so that we can easily distinguish between the different tissue types. So I'm quickly going to just talk you through it. I'm not going to label it here. You can go have a look at the labels in your own time, but I'm quickly just going to talk you through the various areas once again and tell you what to look for when you try and identify the tissues. Because obviously the diagram that you get is not necessarily the diagram that you will get in a test. Okay, you have many different diagrams, and you have to be able to identify it regardless of, okay, the specific diagram that you have in your notes. Okay, so the top layer that we see here is the upper epidermis, and we can see that by the bricked shaped cells, and on top of the upper epidermis we have the layer of cuticle that is going to prevent water loss. Underneath the epidermis we have the palisade mesophyll cells, okay, where photosynthesis will take place, and we can identify them by these long perpendicular cells underneath the upper epidermis. Then above the vein and between the vein and the epidermis we have a layer of collenchyma tissue. Okay, and as mentioned, this will help to strengthen the plant and protect the vascular bundle. and we can identify the collenchyma by their thick cell walls around the collenchyma. Then continuing from there, we have the other type of mesophyll, the spongy mesophyll, okay, and we can see that by the big intercellular spaces in between the cells, okay, where gaseous exchange is going to take place. Okay, so it has this spongy texture. Then moving on to the vein, okay, so in the vein we have the xylem at the top and the phloem at the bottom, and around the xylem and the phloem, okay, we have the sclerenchyma. And then continuing with another layer of collenchyma, okay, for the same reasons as mentioned at the top, and finishing off at the bottom with the lower epidermis. But it's very important, okay, one of the structures, special structures that you find in the lower epidermis is the stomata. Okay, so the stomata where the gaseous exchange will take place. Okay, so make sure you can identify the stomata. And then here you have the diagram that you have in your notes. Okay, and if you don't have the labels, then you can use these labels, okay, to label the diagram in your notes. Okay, so to finish off this section on leaves, we're going to look at the adaptations of leaves for photosynthesis. So what does this mean? Okay, so this is something that is quite important for you to realize early on, because all throughout life science, we oftentimes look at the adaptations of something for a specific function. And this is kind of one of the core elements of life science. We want to know why things are good for a specific purpose. Okay, so there's many examples of this. We look at the adaptations of organisms for their specific environment. So why are certain plants good in a specific type of climate? Or why are specific animals very good at surviving in a specific climate? Or you can go even deeper and look at why organs inside of the human body is very good at a specific function. Or in the case here, we're going to look at why are leaves good at photosynthesis. Okay, so we're also tying this back to what we said at the start. We looked at the function of the various organs, and I said the functions are important because the structure of the plant and the structure of the organs is going to inform why it has that specific function. So this is kind of the payoff to that. So we're going to look at why are these structures that we look at so good at photosynthesis, okay, and why are leaves so good at photosynthesis, okay, and we refer to that as the adaptations of leaves for photosynthesis. So whenever you see this adaptations, just know that this is, okay, something that we mention a lot, and it's something that we often like to ask in papers because it kind of gets to the core of what life science is about, or one of the core elements of what life science is about. Okay, so that's enough rambling. So the first thing here is the large leaf blade of the leaves makes it very good at photosynthesis because it can absorb as much sun as possible. Okay, so if you have a look at the structures of leaves, then all of the other structures are quite tube-like in their appearance. Okay, so if you compare the width and the length, okay, then it's a lot longer than it is wide. But the exception to that is the leaves. Okay, the leaves try and has as big a surface area as possible so that it can absorb the most sun possible. That's not always the case. There is exceptions, okay, and we'll talk about some of that exceptions later on. But for the main part, mostly plants want to have as big leaves as possible. Next, the leaves are quite thin, and the epidermis of the leaves are also quite thin, and both of these is to maximize gaseous exchange. Okay, so to allow gases to move through the leaves as quickly as possible, so okay, it doesn't get hung up on that process, so gases can just move in and out very quickly. Also, the spongy mesophyll of the leaves has a layer of moisture around it, so the whole inside of the leaf has quite a high level of moisture, and this is because the gases dissolve in the moisture, which makes the fusion a lot easier and a lot quicker. Okay, so this is another thing, common trait that you will see in living things. Okay, moisture allows diffusion to happen a lot smoother. So this, again, something that will come up quite often. And then the veins, so the fact that the veins spread out all throughout the leaf, it almost makes the like a skeleton for the leaf. Okay, not quite, but it does provide that rigidity that allows the leaf to stay open, so that it is exposed to the sun for long periods of time, and as the maximum surface exposed to the sun, to maximize photosynthesis once again. And then lastly, the many stomata, especially along the underside of the leaf, okay, once again, helps with gaseous exchange. And I didn't mention this earlier. The reason gaseous exchange is important is because photosynthesis needs carbon dioxide, okay, and it's going to produce oxygen. Okay, so you need carbon dioxide in and oxygen out as quickly as possible so that photosynthesis, okay, is sped up. So this is why they mention gaseous exchange here, because it once again ties in with photosynthesis. So then moving on, we are going to have a look at the second organ, okay, and we're going to have a look at roots. So we're going to have a look at the cross section through a root, so we can see the different tissues that is found inside of the root, okay, to perform its specific functions. So just to quickly recap, what is the function of the roots? So the first function is to anchor the plant in the soil, and then very importantly to absorb water and nutrients from the soil. Okay, so again, as we go through it, make sure that you try and understand the structure of the root in terms of these functions. And then the root is again divided into three areas: the epidermis, the cortex, and the stele. So the first area of the root that we're going to look at is the epidermis. Okay, so this is the same as the first layer that we looked at in the leaf, and also the same as the first layer that we're going to look at in the stem. So the epidermis is made from a layer of epidermal cells along the surface of the root. Okay, so again, it's the same type of cells that we find in the leaf and in the stem, with one big difference that we'll discuss now at the end. But the main function of the epidermal cells in the root is to absorb water. Okay, so that's the main function of the root, and it starts with the epidermal cells. Okay, and one way that roots increase the amount of water that can be absorbed is through specialized epidermal cells called root hairs. So we've talked about root hairs when we looked at plant tissue, but just to recap, okay, so root hairs have this protruding cell wall that increases the absorption area where water can be absorbed. Okay, so this is the main function of the epidermis, is to absorb the water from the soil, and the root hairs are specialized epidermal cells which increase the surface area for absorption. Now, one big difference between the epidermis in the roots compared to the leaves and the stem is that the epidermis in roots do not have a cuticle. Because remember, the cuticle in leaves prevent water loss because it is a waxy layer that does not allow water to move through. So in the case of the roots, that would be a problem. You don't want a layer on the outside of the root that is going to prevent water to pass through, because then the water won't be able to absorb. So in the case of the roots, there is no cuticle on the outside of the epidermis. Okay, so very important. So the second area inside of the root is the cortex. Okay, and that is the layer of tissue between the epidermis and the vascular cylinder here in the middle, or the stele. Okay, and it is mostly comprised of parenchyma tissue. And the parenchyma tissue in this case doesn't have a extremely important function. Obviously, it does serve a purpose and does have a function, okay, but it's not as integral to the functioning as some of the other tissues that we are going to discuss. So the main function of the parenchyma tissue is just to transport substances between the epidermis, okay, and the vascular cylinder. So the water gets absorbed here by the epidermis and then needs to get transported to the vascular cylinder so that it can be transported to the other parts of the plant. So the main function here is just to allow the gases exchange and diffusion of substances between the epidermis and the vascular cylinder. Then the internal layer, or the innermost layer of the cortex, okay, the layer that just goes around the vascular cylinder, that is called the endodermis. Okay, and the endodermis, that does have quite an important function, or it plays quite a large role in the whole absorption process of water and minerals, okay, mainly water. We're going to talk a bit more about this when we discuss the transport of or transport inside of plants, but basically the endodermis has this layer of impermeable material inside of its cell walls that prevents water from moving through, but it's only inside of the cell walls. So this means the water can still move through the cells, just not through the cell walls. So this has an effect on how water is transported in the root, how the water gets from the epidermis into the vascular cylinder. But we'll talk a bit more about this when we do transport systems in plants. Just know for now, okay, that the endodermis has the Casparian strips, which regulates the flow of water. So the last area of the root that we're going to look at is called the stele, or sometimes called the vascular cylinder or central cylinder. And similar to the vascular bundle in leaves, the function of the vascular cylinder is transport. Okay, so this is the transport part of the root. So for that reason, we see the two vascular tissues found in the vascular cylinder. So we see the xylem and we see the phloem. So the xylem is quite nicely forms this X shape inside of the root. So it's quite easy to identify it, okay, because it forms this very distinctive X shape. And obviously the function of the xylem is the same as it is in other parts of the plant. It is to transport water and minerals from the roots to the rest of the plant. The phloem is then located around the xylem, so in these bundles around the xylem. And again, the function of the phloem is the same as in other parts of the plant. It transports dissolved organic food from the leaves to the roots in this case. Okay, so remember we said earlier that in the leaves it makes glucose and other organic molecules, and those organic molecules then needs to be transported to the roots where it can be used or stored, okay, and it gets there via the phloem. Okay, so that's the function of the phloem, is to transport dissolved organic food from the leaves to the roots. And then the last part of the vascular cylinder is just inside of the endodermis. Okay, you find a layer called the pericycle. Okay, and the pericycle is made up of meristematic tissue. Now, if you forgot what meristematic tissue is, then I suggest you just quickly go recap in the plant tissue video or in your plant tissue notes. Okay, but the meristematic tissue is the undifferentiated cells of plants. Undifferentiated meaning they're not specialized, so they can still specialize and become any other type of tissue. So they are the tissue responsible for growth in the plants. So in this case, the layer, the pericycle, is a layer of meristematic tissue, okay, that can grow the roots further. Specifically, the pericycle will result in lateral roots growing out from the central root. Okay, so this will form lateral roots growing outwards, so that you can extend the network of roots. And this is due to the meristematic tissue found in the pericycle. And then again, if we take all of those tissues that we discussed and we put them together, then that should give us an idea of what the cross-section of a root will look like. So again, I will talk you through the types of tissues and the areas very briefly, and you can label it in your own time. So along the outside here, we have the epidermal tissue, okay, that is going to be absorbing the water, and we see here the specialized epidermal cells called the root hairs, okay, that increases the surface area for absorption. Then continuing below that, we have the cortex, okay, which is made up of parenchyma tissue, okay, which is going to transport substances between the epidermis and the vascular cylinder. Then the inside layer of the cortex is called the endodermis. Okay, and remember, this is going to regulate the water moving into the vascular cylinder. Then just below that, we have the layer of pericycle, okay, or the pericycle layer, okay, which is meristematic tissue responsible for the growth of the roots, specifically the formation of lateral roots to extend the root system of the plant. And then inside of that, we have the two transport tissues. So we have the xylem that forms this X, okay, that is going to transport water and minerals from the roots to the rest of the plant. And around the xylem, okay, we have bundles of phloem, okay, that is going to transport organic materials from the leaves down back to the roots, where it can be used or can be stored. So then over here we have the labels of the roots for the diagram that you have in your notes. Okay, so again, make sure you know these labels and make sure you can label this regardless of this specific diagram. Okay, you should be able to label this on any diagram that I give you in a test or exam, regardless of how it looks specifically in this diagram. So don't just study the order of the labels. Okay, also know the structure of the root. Okay, so like how it is layered and what the different tissues look like. So the last organ that we are going to look at is the stem. And again, we're going to take a look at the cross section of the stem, and we're going to see the tissues that make up the stem and how they contribute to the overall functioning of the stem. So just to recap, what is the function of the stem? Okay, the main function that we're going to focus on is the link between the roots and the leaves, specifically to help with support and transport. Okay, but there is also some other functions that I mentioned at the start as well. Okay, so it also carries the leaves in favorable positions for photosynthesis. Okay, so all along the stem you will find branches and leaves. Okay, and the stem allows the leaves to grow in these positions where they can maximize their ability for photosynthesis. And also along the stem you will find flowers. Okay, and the flowers is the organs responsible for helping the plants reproduce and spread through pollination. So having the flowers in favorable positions where they can pollinate, and we're going to look at next year at how pollination takes place, but having them in positions where they're favorable for pollination, okay, is obviously good for the plants so that the plants can spread. Then the four areas of the stem that we're going to look at is once again the epidermis, the cortex, the vascular bundles, and then the pith. So the first area of the stem is, okay, similar to the leaves and the roots, okay, the epidermis found along the outside, along the surface of the stem. Okay, so it's again made from epidermal cells and again found on the surface of the stem, so it's the outermost layer. In the case of the stem, the epidermal cells do have a cuticle because the stem, just like the leaves, are exposed to the outside, to the outside environment, so it is susceptible to drying out or desiccation. So to prevent that, the epidermal cells secrete a cuticle that prevents it from drying out. So the next area in the stem is the cortex. So very similar to the cortex in the roots, but the big difference here is the prominence of the cortex layer. It's much thinner, at least compared to the overall size of the stem. There isn't as big a layer of cortex, and it varies between different types of plants. But again, it is mainly made from ground tissue, and the main the two types of ground tissue found in the cortex is collenchyma for support. So the collenchyma is usually found right below the epidermis, and then a few layers of parenchyma tissue that is found in between the collenchyma and the vascular bundles. Again, it's the main function of the parenchyma is for storage. Then we get to the primary area inside of the stem, which are the vascular bundles. So you'll see that there's a bunch of these acorn-looking structures, and these are what we refer to as the vascular bundles. So again, vascular referring to transport. Okay, so here we will find the transport tissue, the xylem, and the phloem. Okay, but there's also some other structures that we are going to look at. So let's have a look at the vascular bundle, and we're going to go from the inside outwards. So the innermost layer of the vascular bundle is the xylem. And just like in other parts of the plant, the xylem is responsible for transport of minerals and water from the roots to the rest of the plant. Okay, so the function doesn't change. It is just the way it is structured in the stem is slightly different, or very different. Okay, but then moving on from the xylem, we have a layer of cambium tissue, a very thin layer, so you can't always see it that clearly. But the cambium is another example of meristematic tissue inside of plants. And remember, meristematic tissue are undifferentiated, so they are used for growth in plants. And the primary function of the meristematic tissue is the increasing the thickness of the stem. And we refer to this as secondary thickening. Okay, so unfortunately we're not doing it this year, but secondary thickening is the lateral growth of plants. So primary growth is the growing in length, and then secondary thickening or secondary growth is the increasing the thickness of the plant, okay, or increasing the width. So that is the function of the cambium. So the cambium divides to form secondary xylem and phloem to basically create more xylem and phloem, and over the years this dividing of tissue, creating more tissue layers, is going to increase the width of the stem. So the stem will grow outwards. Then moving on from the cambium, the next layer that we see is the phloem, just above the cambium. And again, the function of the phloem is the same as in other parts of the plant, is the transport of organic molecules from the leaves to the rest of the plant. And the last layer that we find in the vascular bundle, indicated here by the purple, is the sclerenchyma. So the sclerenchyma, or called the sclerenchyma cap, is just a supporting tissue found on the outside of the vascular bundles to provide some protection, especially in the early years of the plant or in the young plants, so that the vascular bundles are protected from any kind of stresses or potential damage that it could receive from the outside. So the sclerenchyma cap is just some support or strengthening tissue on the outside of the vascular bundle. So here we just have a simplified example of a vascular bundle with the labels and the different layers that we find there. So yeah, this, make sure you know, okay, the order of the labels: xylem, the innermost layer, then the cambium, then the phloem, and then the sclerenchyma cap. And then the last area inside of the stem is the pith, or the medulla. And that is just the big area here in the middle, and really it doesn't have a very important function. It's just a layer or a bunch of parenchyma tissue that makes up this middle layer, and it just is kind of just there to fill the area. It will have some storage, or it will store some nutrients, but the main function there is just to fill the space in between the layer of vascular tissue that goes around it. And then again, if we then take all of these tissues and we put them together, then we can have a look at the cross section of the stem with this brightly colored tissue, so you can see the different types of tissues. So you can see that there's quite a bit going on here. And again, I'll just briefly talk through the different parts of the stem. So again, on the outside, you find the epidermis layer with the cuticle to prevent water loss. Then underneath that, the brown layer over here is the collenchyma for support. Then underneath that, you have a few layers of parenchyma tissue. And then in some plants, not all plants, you will find an endodermis layer, which is similar to the endodermis found in the roots. Okay, but don't worry too much about that. We don't have any notes on that. But then moving on from there, you have the star of the show when it comes to the stem being the vascular bundles. Okay, and in this case, we looked at it and we said the inner layer is the xylem, then we have a layer of cambium, then a layer of phloem, and then the sclerenchyma cap. Okay, so study this in conjunction with the notes, okay, and understand why all of these types of tissues is important inside of the stem. And then this is just the diagram that you have in your notes. Okay, so again, make sure you know the labels, but make sure you can identify these structures regardless of the specific diagram that you get. Okay, so that is it for plant organs. We've looked at all three organs in depth, and we looked at all of the tissues found in all of these organs, and we discussed the function of all of the organs. So that's kind of the main way to determine whether you understand this, is to ask yourself, okay, what is the function of each of the organs, and how does the structure of the organs allow each of these functions? So we've discussed this all throughout the video, so I hope that gives you a good overview and you understand it a bit better. So like I said, make sure you can link the structure with the function, and that if you can do that, then that should mean you have a pretty good understanding of, okay, how plants are structured and the organs found inside of the plants.